This week's topic is markets, and within that, we're going to introduce the analysis of demand and supply, which is central to economics in the sense that economists use this framework of demand and supply to study pretty much everything. Here's a common definition of what economics is. This is something that I used to find in the textbooks that I read in university, and I didn't understand the significance of this definition until much later. What we say is economics is the study of allocating scarce resources across alternative uses. So we already know what we mean by scarcity. Because resources are scarce, we need to allocate them carefully across different uses. And so the basic question in economics is, what should we produce, how should we produce, and for whom should we produce? Broadly speaking, we have two ways of answering this question, or two ways of addressing the question of allocation. One is we rely on markets to allocate resources, and the second way to allocate resources is central planning, where a central figure, a dictator maybe, or a government decides the questions of allocation in an economy. When we say market allocation, what we mean is these decisions are left to individuals interacting voluntarily, so nobody is explicitly driving them. They are interacting voluntarily in their self-interest. And there's no explicit coordination, but without explicit coordination, thousands and thousands of people are able to interact with each other through something called the price mechanism. What we are going to do at the end of this module, the module of markets, is we want to discuss some properties of market allocation. So what do markets achieve? Do they achieve outcomes that are efficient? Do they achieve outcomes that are equitable? So this is what we are going to work towards answering in this module. We'll start with a fairly unrealistic benchmark model. Benchmark is something that we measure everything against. So this is the model of perfectly competitive markets. When we say that, what we mean are the following. In this market, we trade one good and all units of that good are identical. So market is any way defined for one good at a time. Okay, that good could be apples, that good could be labor, and what we are going to assume for simplicity is all units of the good are identical. So we'll start with a discussion of markets by looking at something called perfectly competitive markets. Now, there are two reasons why we start with this. Number one, perfectly competitive markets are a benchmark. What we mean by a benchmark is we're going to use this market, or we're going to use this model to compare all other markets, more realistic markets, and produce different ways of comparing or highlighting how imperfect outcomes are in those markets. So in that sense, benchmarking is useful. The other reason why we start with perfectly competitive markets is it's much simpler. And because we want to study some essential features of the real world, a simple model of perfectly competitive markets will do for now. So here are some defining features of this market. Number one, all units of the good are identical. What this means is whatever good that we're talking about, whether it's apples, if it's the labor market, we're talking about workers, all units of the good are identical. So all apples are identical, or all workers are identical. The second thing that we assume is buyers and sellers in the market are fully informed about the good. So there's no lack of information about the good on either end. The third assumption is the assumption of zero transaction costs. Transaction costs are costs that you pay in order to participate in the market. So just to enter the market and to be able to use the price mechanism in the market, sometimes we may have to pay a price. Sometimes we may have to pay a fee. So that if that exists, we will say that there are transaction costs. We are going to keep it simple and assume that there are no such costs. And finally, we'll assume that buyers and sellers are price takers. So price takers are buyers and sellers who cannot influence the market price on their own. So each buyer and each seller, when they're acting keeping in mind that their actions are not going to have an effect on the market price. And this is because they are too small relative to the market. So there are so many buyers and so many sellers that relative to the rest of the market, they are too small. An additional feature that we will assume is the assumption of no externalities. So what we mean by externalities, actually, let me just say what we mean by the assumption of no externalities. What we mean here is the consumption or the production of the good does not affect third parties. We will have more to say about externalities later on in this semester, but for now, this is what we are going to assume. So in terms of the next 2 weeks, we are going to start with this week. We're going to talk about demand and supply. And then we'll also introduce the concept of willingness to pay, willingness to sell, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. Next week, we are going to continue with chapters 3 and 5, but we will talk about market equilibrium, and we will talk about how we can use economic surplus to compare alternatives. This is anyway the title that the textbook uses. The topic next week is going to be allocation achieved through markets, and we'll discuss the properties of market allocation.